November 1943. The convoy commander aboard the transport Terukawa Maru watched the third ship in his formation erupt in flames. No warning, no torpedo wake visible in the darkness. Just a massive explosion amidships, the kind that breaks a freighter's back. And then the screaming started as men scrambled for lifeboats that weren't there anymore. 12,000 tons of rice, ammunition, and replacement troops for Rabaul, gone in under 4 minutes. The commander, a career officer named Captain Yoshida Takeo, had been assured before departure that American submarines were a manageable problem, that the Imperial Navy had the situation well in hand. He gripped the bridge rail as a fourth ship, a tanker carrying aviation fuel, took a hit below the waterline. The explosion lit up the night like a small sun. Yoshida could see the submarine's periscope now, impossibly close, moving between his remaining ships like a predator selecting its next meal. He had 6 escorts for 23 merchant vessels. The Americans had sent at least 2 submarines, maybe 3. His escorts dropped depth charges blindly into the dark water, the explosions sending up white plumes that revealed absolutely nothing. The submarines kept firing. In Tokyo, 400 miles away, Admiral Nagano Osami sat in a conference room reviewing reports that should have terrified him. They didn't. The chief of the Naval General Staff looked at the numbers, merchant tonnage lost to submarine action, and saw a problem, certainly, but not a crisis. Not yet. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built around a different vision of warfare. Battleships, carriers, the decisive surface engagement that would crush the American fleet in one glorious action. Submarines were a secondary concern, a nuisance to be managed, not a threat that could strangle an empire. Nagano had spent his career preparing for Tsushima Strait, for the moment when Japanese steel would meet American steel in open battle. The idea that the war might be won or lost by submarines hunting merchant ships in the dark, that this unglamorous, almost dishonorable form of warfare could prove decisive, it didn't fit the framework through which he understood naval power. So the reports got filed, the losses noted, and the Imperial Navy continued building battleships while American submarines rewrote the rules of Pacific warfare. The first indicators had come early. 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor, when American submarines began operating in Japanese waters. The results were unimpressive. Torpedo failures plagued the American effort. Duds, premature detonations, torpedoes that ran too deep or broke up on impact. Japanese convoy commanders reported submarine contacts, occasional attacks, but minimal damage. A ship sunk here, another there, nothing that suggested a strategic threat. The Japanese Navy's confidence seemed justified. Their merchant fleet, 8 million tons at the start of the war, remained largely intact. The submarines were annoying, like mosquitoes, but hardly deadly. Japanese naval doctrine, shaped by decades of planning for the decisive battle, had allocated minimal resources to anti-submarine warfare. Fewer than 50 escort vessels existed when the war began. The destroyers and cruisers that might have protected merchant shipping were instead assigned to carrier task forces, to battleship divisions, to the fleet actions that would decide the war. Or so the thinking went. But something changed in mid-1943. The Americans fixed their torpedoes. Suddenly, the mosquitoes had fangs. USS Wahoo, under Commander Dudley Morton, sank 9 ships in a single patrol. USS Tang began a rampage that would eventually account for 33 Japanese vessels. USS Flasher, USS Rasher, USS Barb, submarines whose names meant nothing to Japanese planners, started appearing in patrol reports with increasing frequency, and the numbers shifted. January through June 1943, American submarines sank approximately 300,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. July through December, that number jumped to over 600,000 tons. The rate was accelerating. Convoys that left port with 20 ships arrived with 12. then 8, then not at all. Captain Yoshida survived the November attack, though 16 of his 23 ships didn't. He filed a detailed report when he reached Rabaul, describing the attack, the inadequacy of his escorts, the way the American submarines had operated with what seemed like perfect knowledge of his route and timing. His report went to the Combined Fleet Headquarters, then to the Naval General Staff. It joined hundreds of similar reports, stacking up in filing cabinets, each one describing the same pattern. Convoys ambushed, multiple ships sunk, escorts ineffective. The submarines escaped. The pattern was undeniable to anyone reading the reports in sequence. But the reports weren't being read in sequence. They were being processed individually, each one an isolated incident, a tactical problem rather than a strategic catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. The institutional barriers to recognizing the threat ran deep. The Imperial Japanese Navy had separated its merchant marine from its military operations. Civilian ships, even when carrying military cargo, were not considered part of the Navy's core responsibility. This wasn't just bureaucratic division. It reflected a cultural attitude. Merchant shipping was commerce, trade, the unglamorous business of moving goods. The Navy existed for battle, for glory, for the decisive engagement that would prove Japanese superiority. Escort duty, anti-submarine warfare, these were defensive operations, and the Japanese military culture, steeped in Bushido traditions, emphasized attack. Defense was what you did when you were losing. Japan was winning, or so the early war successes suggested. Why divert resources to defensive operations when offensive power was what won wars? Vice Admiral Fukudome Shigeru, serving as Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, later admitted they had fundamentally misunderstood submarine warfare's potential. The Japanese Navy had studied the German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, had seen how the Allies responded with massive anti-submarine efforts, convoy systems, escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft. But they drew the wrong conclusions. They saw the Allied response as proof that submarines could be countered, not as evidence of how dangerous submarines were when left unchecked. The Japanese Navy assumed they could implement similar countermeasures when necessary. They didn't grasp that, when necessary, might be too late, that the window for effective response was narrow and closing fast. The technical deficiencies compounded the institutional ones. Japanese sonar technology lagged behind Allied systems. Their depth charges, while functional, lacked the explosive power and sinking speed of American weapons. More critically, they had no equivalent to the Allies' Hedgehog, the forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar that allowed escorts to attack without losing sonar contact. Japanese escorts dropped depth charges over the stern, meaning they went blind during the attack, giving submarines precious seconds to evade. Japanese destroyer captains knew this. They filed reports requesting better equipment, more training, additional escorts. The requests were noted and largely ignored. The resources went to building more carriers, more battleships, more of the weapons that fit the Navy's vision of how the war would be won. By late 1943, the evidence had become overwhelming. The Naval General Staff finally authorized creation of the Grand Escort Command, a centralized organization to protect merchant shipping. It was established in November, nearly 2 years into the war. Admiral Oikawa Koshiro took command with a force of approximately 180 escorts to protect the entire Japanese merchant fleet across the Pacific. The Allies, defending the Atlantic convoys, had deployed over 3,000 escort vessels. The disparity was staggering. Oikawa did what he could with what he had. He implemented convoy routing, established patrol zones, concentrated his limited forces on the most critical supply routes. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. The American submarine force, fewer than 200 boats, was sinking ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The oil tankers went first, or rather, they went most catastrophically. Japan's war machine ran on petroleum imported from the Dutch East Indies. Every month, tankers had to make the run from Borneo and Sumatra to the home islands, carrying the crude oil that would become aviation fuel, diesel for ships, gasoline for trucks. The route passed through waters the Americans called the Luzon Straits Turkey Chute. Submarines waited in, patrol lines, sometimes 4 or 5 boats working in coordination, guided by intelligence from code-breaking operations the Japanese didn't know existed. The tankers were slow, predictable, and absolutely vital. Between January and December 1944, American submarines sank approximately 600,000 tons of tanker capacity. That represented over 60% of Japan's tanker fleet. The oil still flowed from the refineries in the East Indies, but it couldn't reach Japan. Reserves dwindled. Fuel rationing began, first for civilians, then for the military. Pilots received less training because there wasn't fuel for practice flights. Ships stayed in port because there wasn't fuel for operations. The American submarines weren't just sinking ships, they were draining the blood from Japan's war effort. Commander Nakagawa Hajime, captain of the destroyer Shimakaze, one of the fastest warships in the Imperial Navy, wrote a letter to his wife in March 1944 that captured the growing desperation. He described hunting an American submarine for 6 hours, dropping over 40 depth charges, certain they'd made a kill. Then watching that same submarine surface 10 miles away, unharmed, and sink 2 more merchant ships before submerging again and disappearing. Nakagawa was an experienced officer. His ship was equipped with the best sonar the Japanese Navy had, and he'd been completely outmatched. He wrote that fighting the American submarines felt like trying to catch smoke. You knew they were there, you could see the damage they caused, but you couldn't touch them. The letter was intercepted by sensors and never delivered. The sensors flagged it for defeatist content. But Nakagawa wasn't being defeatist. He was being accurate. The statistics told a story the Japanese High Command could no longer ignore. 1944 was the year the merchant fleet died. American submarines sank over 600 ships that year, totaling approximately 2.4 million tons. That was more than the entire Japanese shipbuilding industry could produce. The merchant fleet was shrinking, not slowly but catastrophically. Routes that had seen daily traffic now saw weekly convoys. Then nothing. Islands that depended on supply from the home islands began to starve. Garrisons in the Pacific, cut off by American submarines, ran out of ammunition, medicine, food. Soldiers on bypassed islands resorted to eating bark and roots, dying not from combat, but from malnutrition. The submarines were winning a war of attrition that the Japanese High Command had never planned for and couldn't counter. Admiral Toyoda Soimu, who became Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in May 1944, inherited a situation that was already beyond recovery. He understood the submarine threat. He'd read the reports, seen the numbers, recognized the crisis. But understanding a problem and solving it were different things. Japan's shipyards were already running at maximum capacity, and most of that capacity was going to naval construction, not merchant ships. The destroyers and escorts needed for anti-submarine warfare took months to build, and Japan didn't have months. The American submarine offensive was happening now, sinking ships faster than they could be replaced or protected. Toyota requested more escorts, more patrol aircraft, better sonar, more depth charges. He received a fraction of what he needed. The resources weren't there. They'd been spent building the battleship Yamato, the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, the heavy cruisers and fleet destroyers that were supposed to win the decisive battle. Those ships were magnificent. They were also increasingly irrelevant in a war being won by submarines hunting merchant ships in the dark. The human cost mounted alongside the tonnage. Merchant sailors, once volunteers seeking adventure and decent pay, became conscripts forced into service no one wanted. The survival rate for Japanese merchant sailors by late 1944 was worse than for combat infantry. A merchant sailor could expect to be sunk at least once, probably twice, possibly 3 times before the war ended or he died. Lifeboats and life jackets were in short supply. Rescue operations were minimal. If your ship went down, you had maybe a 50-50 chance of being picked up. That assumed there were other ships in the convoy that survived and had time to stop. Many convoys, after being attacked, scattered and ran, leaving survivors in the water. The merchant marine, essential to Japan's survival, had become a death sentence. The food situation became critical by early 1945. Japan had never been self-sufficient in food production. The home islands depended on rice imports from Korea and Taiwan, fish from the coastal waters, and increasingly, whatever could be grown in every available plot of land. But the fertilizer came by ship. The fishing boats needed fuel that came by ship. The rice from Korea traveled by ship, and the ships kept sinking. Ration levels dropped. First for civilians, then for workers in essential industries, finally for the military. Soldiers training for the defense of the home islands were receiving fewer than 2,000 calories per day, barely enough to sustain basic function, certainly not enough for combat readiness. The American submarines hadn't just cut off oil and raw materials, they'd cut off food. Japan was starving. In the final months of the war, the Japanese merchant fleet had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning entity. Of the 8 million tons of shipping Japan had possessed in December 1941, approximately 600,000 tons remained operational by August 1945. That represented a loss of over 90%. American submarines had sunk approximately 5.3 million tons of that total, roughly 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping losses. The rest fell to mines, aircraft, and surface action. But the submarines were the primary killer. They'd done it with a force that never exceeded 200 boats on patrol at any given time. The American submarine service represented less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel. They'd accounted for more than half of Japan's maritime losses. The return on investment was staggering. The Japanese High Command's response, when it finally came with full force, arrived too late to matter. By 1945, the Grand Escort Command had expanded to over 300 escorts, had implemented sophisticated convoy routing, had trained crews in anti-submarine warfare, had even developed some effective tactics. But there was nothing left to protect. The convoys had stopped running because there weren't enough ships to form convoys. The oil tankers were gone, the food ships were gone, the ore carriers were gone. Japan's industrial production, which had peaked in 1944, collapsed in 1945 not because of bombing, though that contributed, but because the raw materials stopped arriving. Steel mills shut down for lack of ore. Refineries closed for lack of crude oil. Aircraft factories stopped production for lack of aluminum. The submarines had severed the arteries that kept the Japanese war machine alive. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, who served as Navy Minister in the final months of the war, later reflected on the submarine campaign with something approaching awe. He stated that the American submarines had done more to defeat Japan than any other single factor. Not the island-hopping campaign, not the strategic bombing, not even the atomic bombs, though those provided the final psychological shock. The submarines, operating largely unseen, had strangled Japan's ability to sustain the war. They'd done it methodically, relentlessly, with a patience that matched the vast distances of the Pacific. Every ship they sank was one less ship carrying oil, or rice, or ammunition, or reinforcements. The cumulative effect was collapse. The cultural and institutional factors that prevented an effective Japanese response remained in place until the end. The emphasis on offensive operations never wavered. The battleship Yamato, pride of the Imperial Navy, made its final sortie in April 1945 on a one-way suicide mission, carrying only enough fuel for the trip to Okinawa. There wasn't fuel for a return voyage. The ship that symbolized Japanese naval power, that had consumed resources equivalent to building dozens of escorts, was sent to die because there was no other role for it. The decisive surface battle it had been built for never came. The war was being won by submarines, and the Japanese Navy had built the wrong fleet to fight that war. The irony was profound. Japan, an island nation utterly dependent on maritime trade, had failed to protect its merchant fleet. The Imperial Navy, one of the most powerful naval forces in the world in 1941, had been outfought by a submarine force that most navies considered a secondary arm. The Japanese had studied naval warfare extensively, had learned from history, had built a fleet designed to win, and they'd lost to an enemy that attacked their weakest point, the one they'd left undefended because defending it didn't fit their vision of how wars were won. In the end, what the Japanese High Command said when they discovered American submarines were sinking, everything was too little, too late, and largely irrelevant. They'd said it in 1942 when the threat was manageable, and they dismissed it. They'd said it in 1943 when the crisis was building, and they'd responded inadequately. They'd said it in 1944 when the situation was catastrophic, and they'd lacked the resources to fix it. By 1945, when they fully grasped the magnitude of what the submarines had done, there was nothing left to say. The merchant fleet was gone, the oil was gone, the food was gone, the war was over, though it took 2 atomic bombs to make that official. The submarines had already won. They'd done it quietly, methodically, sinking ships in the dark while the battleships and carriers fought for headlines. They'd strangled an empire, one convoy at a time, and the Japanese High Command had watched it happen, understanding too late that the war they'd prepared for wasn't the war they were fighting. The numbers remained stark. 1,300 Japanese merchant ships sunk, 5.3 million tons sent to the bottom, 55% of all Japanese maritime losses, 200 Japanese warships destroyed. An empire's economy collapsed, all accomplished by fewer than 16,000 American submariners, of whom approximately 3,600 died in service. The American submarine force suffered the highest casualty rate of any U.S. military branch in World War II, but their impact on the war's outcome was disproportionate to their numbers. They proved that modern warfare wasn't just about the decisive battle, the clash of fleets, the glory of surface combat. It was about logistics, sustainability, the unglamorous work of cutting supply lines and watching your enemies slowly bleed out. The Japanese High Command had learned that lesson. They'd learned it too late, and in the learning, they'd lost a war.